School 2020. I'm happy that we have tonight with us Sezgin Boynik for a presentation of his long-term observation, to call it like that. The lecture is called Living with Contradictions, Contemporary Art and Nationalism. For this lecture we also invited Andi Haxhiu to discuss with Sezgin initially after the presentation. The presentation should be around 40 minutes. Andi will have some space after. I'll just briefly read a condensed, let's say, text and briefly some of your background. Yes.
Are you reading the summary?
I'm going to read the summary, just even shorter than the summary. So the aim of the lecture, as part of the public program, is to discuss the relationship between contemporary art and nationalism. The lecture will challenge the widely accepted claim that contemporary art is unsusceptible of nationalism. I argue that, Sezgin argues that despite the incompatible differences, nationalism is reproduced in the field of contemporary art and through very subtle and sophisticated structures. However, the link between contemporary art and contemporary art practices and nationalist ideologies, which are mediated by cultural institutions, is full of contradictions. By studying and discussing these contradictions, the aim is to shift the theoretical and methodological perspective of the study of nationalism to more challenging grounds. Sezgin will be focusing on conceptual implications of aligning nationalism with contemporary art, as well as discussing the historical precedents of the shift of contemporary art to nationalism by researching the role of postmodernism in the 80s. It will attempt to specify at which point the social tendency of contemporary art practice became centered around questions of nation and identity. Something about his work. So Sezgin is a theoretician based in Helsinki currently. He completed his PhD on Yugoslav black wave cinema. He co-edited Nationalism and Contemporary Art, a critical leader, in 2007, and History of Punk and Underground of Turkey, 2008. Recent publication included Noise After Babel, Language Unrestrained, 2015, with me. There's further on. There are texts in the space. I'm just going to read briefly about a short biography of Andi Haxhiu. He holds a MA Nationalism Studies and a PhD. He's currently a PhD student in sociology at the University of Edinburgh. He's a teaching assistant in nations and nationalism and sociological imagination in the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. His research interests include the role of museums in nation building, memory studies in divided societies, and the decolonization of museums.
Well, I'm very happy.
So, the floor is yours. Without further ado, thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, Albert. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And I hope this will be interesting for you. In fact, I have to tell this immediately, this is not a subject I am dealing for some few years. But as Albert announced, that is something that I have written since like mid-2000s, from 2005 onwards. I decided to talk about this topic because at some point nationalism, to talk about nationalism within contemporary art to me seems quite absurd, contradictory, like ridiculous almost, but at some moment I think it really fits very well. In 2004 and 2005, when I started to work on this subject and wrote some more small interventions, maybe critique of some works or comments, for me this was completely unacceptable connection. That you would bring contemporary art together with the nationalism, and the questions related to nationalism seemed very weird, obscure. But now, and almost 20 years passed, now when I'm thinking, to me it doesn't seem at all unnatural, these connections or this association. And what's the reason? Today I was thinking about it and developed maybe with quick thesis. Perhaps it is to do, and especially for us in this region, the periphery of Europe, let's say. And now also seems that the contemporary art is very much part of the archaic and the traditional thinking and the forms. Through identity politics, through a very narrative-based representations, both content-wise and the forms that are used in contemporary art. So nationalism to me seems quite organically connected to contemporary art, and especially seeing like a lot of works that are uncritically tied within this private, let's say, capital, and within the neoliberal structures, especially here, that is always connected with somehow with the state or with the nationalism. So it is interesting. I'm wondering, this is an open question, how come in 2004 and 2005 for us here in Kosovo, but I have to say, also in Serbia and Turkey, especially these places that I know, and Albania, nationalism was completely anathema. It was anathema in 2004, but there was also quite many artworks that were dealing with a national, let's say, national visuality or national references, and especially it was in Kosovo. So in Kosovo, some artists that I will mention today, including Albert Heta, but also Sokor Bećiri, Erzen Škololi, Luzim Zeciri, who is here as well, and some other artists that you might not know or know now through their works in Manifesta, have done works related to flag. You can see a Kosovo flag, the national flag, which is also the flag of Albania. You can see references to folk traditions in very ambiguous terms. So that works triggered in my understanding of art or writing engagement. At that time I was writing my master thesis on situationist international, which would be something that you cannot imagine something further than nationalism or anything to do with the traditions and identifying or uncritically presenting the national forms. So it was, of course, for me a challenge that I had to deal. But the nationalism, as you know, is a very difficult question. I mean, we can easily refer, and the book that I will soon talk about starts with referring to two theoreticians, both British, who wrote about nationalism, Benedict Anderson and Eric Hobsbawm, and both dealing with legacy, colonial legacy, and dealing with the different modern manifestations of nationalism. So, yeah, nationalism is a constructed. Nationalism is one of the invented traditions. And there have been a lot of theoretical works, a lot of research done that could be easily sort of give us a pretext or theoretical frame to oppose the nationalism, but still it seems it is not so easy. There is some fluidity, something weird in nationalism that escapes this easy or smooth critique opposition. And that's the reason, like Albert mentioned, postmodernism, and that was my aim. Maybe in the future we can do sometimes to look at some critical texts in 80s that are introducing a different, more layered levels of looking at nationalism. Here I can just mention one, Slavoj Žižek, that we already discussed today. And what is that other layers? These other layers are mostly psychoanalytic associations, which complicates the problem even further and removes us from the let's say, political connotations or institutional, very strong material existence of nationalism, the concrete elements of nationalism. So these approaches, which today is quite popular, I guess, still gave a lot of energy to let's say, popularity of these approaches that see an ambiguity in nationalism. In fact, nationalism, let's start with this, is quite a contradictory subject to deal with. And I can a little bit tell how it was for me writing these articles that I will be now speaking about. So, these works that had more than national references in Kosovo contemporary art was made between 2001 to 2005, more or less. Suddenly, almost suddenly disappeared. That's the interesting conjuncture to think about. I will refer to that, and that's like, I would say, now my approach, not to think nationalism outside of a concrete historical context. There is not a continuity of the nationalism. There is a breaks, and these breaks are very much to do with the concrete political situations. And it's almost changing sometimes day to day, almost, let's say. In 2003, 2004, Kosovo contemporary art was quite vibrant. Also, this is little reminder, I guess, what some of you might know, but it is important to mention this. It was quite vibrant. Newly emerging Kosovo artists were exhibiting in many different venues, especially in Europe. I will tell you what was the background of this. 2003-04, that winter, I think, or maybe beginning of 2004, a big grant was awarded to Kosovo art scene. That was a grant awarded by Kulturstiftung des Bundes, German Cultural Foundation, and it was a part of the project relations including other 5 cities in the peripheries of Europe. And it is interesting that Pristina, it was labeled with the cities, Pristina's role in that network was defined with an identity, as something to be discovered. But more pressing, or more, let's say, visible at that time was a curatorial intervention which included Kosovo artists. These were especially 3 exhibitions, I would say 2, particularly 2. These are exhibitions all happened in 2003. Exhibition of Harald Zeman was the first one in Austria. That was an exhibition called Blood and Honey, which included few Kosovo artists. Few months later, René Bloch opened another exhibition called In the Gorges of Balkan, in the hills of Balkan. There was more artists from Kosovo present. This was, of course, a big success. I remember the René Bloch. By the way, just a few information. I don't want to assume that you know Harald Zeman and René Bloch, but few information just to know who were these people. Harald Zeman is considered to be a first curator. He made Documenta in 72, but also in 69 he did a work called When Attitudes Become Form. He is the first curator who moved curating practice from the institution where he was working in Switzerland, Bern, through the support of Philip Morris, a big company, into the global scale. So that's Harald Zeman. That's how every curator today would work and is working. Second curator that I mentioned, René Bloch, is a curator who was director of Federicianum, where the exhibition happened, the one I mentioned, and curator who not discovered by me, but made popular and rich of many artists, including Joseph Beuys. So we are talking about a very established curators working internationally in relationship with the private capital, going beyond national representations. But their exhibitions on Balkan had a very weird, I would say, packaging. Harald Zeman's exhibition was called Blood and Honey, which he invented an etymological meaning to Balkan. In Turkish, bal means honey, kan means blood. So that is how he translated Balkan, blood and honey, but it was completely invented origin of the word Balkan. In fact, Balkan is a Turkish word, but means a chain of mountains. And it is a word that is not used anymore in modern Turkish. But Blood and Honey in 2003 fitted completely into the idea how people were thinking about Balkan, which is the way how Emir Kusturica would think about Balkan in his films, and the popular Hollywood imagination of Balkan, where you have this joy and sadness or crazy catharsis and the most gruesome murders or coexisting together, or wedding and funeral, like you have in almost all Francis films. So or Angelina Jolie has a film about Bosnia called Blood and Honey. I mean, let's mention that also. So it really fitted into that fantasy of Balkans. This also is the case with René Bloch. His whole concept was based on the book of Karl May, whom he took as an inspiration to conceptualize the exhibition. Karl May's series with Karabin Nemzi, this British, I don't know, German or British colonialist, traveling in Balkans surrounded with stupid, ignorant people who just don't understand what's going on. And so that is the reference. For example, the titles, of course, contemporary art or generally contemporary culture, as we know, is open to ambiguities, ironies, cynicism, and all that. But the thing was not stopping there in titles. Also the texts which accompanied these exhibitions and the statements were making this fantasy of Balkans even more problematic. Actually, the theoretical frame, or I would say the way to clarify this is, one way to clarify it is to look at Maria Todorova's book on the Balkan. Imagining Balkans? Yeah, Imagining Balkans. Maria Todorova, scholar from Bulgaria, took the Edward Said as an example, and Edward Said studying Orientalism, she applied to Balkan. So this is how Europe has projected the colonial fantasies, the imperial fantasies into this part of the world. It is a big book, if you looked at it, very well written. And I want to read a little one passage from this book of Maria Todorova. She says, because it is, as you might know, Edward Said's idea was that Europe completely produced one representation of Orient, of Orientalism, and all that. But still it is Europe, she says, because Europe has not only produced racism, but anti-racism, not only misogyny, but feminism, not only anti-Semitism, but its criticism. However, a movement that carries a complementary anti-prefix, which can produce an abstraction and can be employed against a movement we can call Balkanism, has not yet emerged. She wrote this 99, 2000? 2000, yeah. And she has a very weird anticipation which went wrong. She was thinking that contemporary art or experimental forms of art would be that anti-prefix to Balkanism. She was imagining like some more advanced artistic cultural practices. And this text, this book of Todorova was influenced to these curators and the scholars that were contributing to their publications. But with these exhibitions, just the contrary happened. The Balkanism, the idea of that very weird, almost mystic Balkan was reproduced even more strongly because it was done in a very subtle manner with the contemporary art, with a very developed artistic cultural works. So that was the moment in that, let's say, that was the theoretical position that I wanted to intervene. And I was back then thinking that by studying each or some of the contemporary artworks and looking more of that like, let's say, discourse around these exhibitions, we could find ways to oppose it and come up with a real anti-something. Maybe not anti to Balkan, but to something, what was going on there. So that was my idea back then. And this anti-something, I really thought it is urgent. Why? Because if you open these books, back then, in 2004, 2005, the relationship, the organic relationship with the curatorial statements and the sponsors were more like this. So sponsors or but patrons would also write in these catalogs. And if you look in some of them, you see really crazy statements. For example, in Harold Zeman's catalog, one of the first texts is written by Erhard Buxek and Karl Heinz Essel. The second one is a patron of that gallery or museum where Harold Zeman did his exhibition. And both are saying the same thing. With this exhibition, we are hoping that contemporary art will be a gate to protect Europe from the flood of primitivism, fundamentalism, meaning masculinity, before was Turkish, which is the extremely racist statements, associating, bringing back that fantasies which we were thinking is over, and we would think there is no place in this world of contemporary art, which then we were naively claiming is ours also. Okay, so this anti was not only anti about curatorial solutions, theoretical positions, but also anti to this very strong connection between private capital, right-wing ideas, and all that people were in fact deciding where money would go. That was his anti. I was thinking we would arrive if we criticize what was going on. And what was there to be criticized? There to criticize was a contemporary art itself, which today, if anything left, what I am doing or engaging with contemporary art is to show that in fact contemporary art is not contemporary as we think. You know, that the very traditional, very reactionary forms coexist in a very spontaneous and natural way. So I worked on this. I published an essay in Turkish original called Theories of Nationalism and Contemporary Art in Kosovo. And then this text, through this text I met few people in Balkans. I have to mention some of them who were among among the rare who have criticized these exhibitions. One is Boris Budin, another was Marina Krasniqi. Apart from these two texts, you can check every journal periodical book from 2003, 4, 5, 6, you will not find. I mean, this was, of course, institutional backup of this discourse. When René Bloch arrived in Pristina, I remember 2004, he made a statement that Pristina contemporary art, the center of avant-garde is, European avant-garde is in Pristina today. And you had 7 artists, 11 videos, like very little. And these were pretty nice, vibrant scene, I remember, but it was not seen that you would say it is a center of avant-garde. So, in my text, I dealt with 2 artists, Albert here, and there in 2004, since Albert is here, I'm expecting an intervention, but in 2004, in an biennial in Cetinje, Montenegro, International Contemporary Art Biennial, curated by René Bloch and Natasha Ilic. Natasha Ilic is now, then also was a member of a collective called WHW. So they made the next contemporary art exhibition. And, I know, this is not, yeah, wait. Albert's work was Kosovo Embassy in Montenegro. It was an artistic intervention that artists open, imagine an embassy, Kosovo Embassy in Montenegro. We are talking about 2004. Kosovo was not recognized as an independent country. And so to have such a work, artistic projection, was a pretty provocative. So the work itself, when we discussed in 2004, it was not only me, a lot of people were discussing, it is a nationalist work. The local newspaper Java has criticized it as a nationalist work. You artists, contemporary artists, longing for representing its own, his, her own state, and projecting these while opening the imaginary embassy. But the more interesting thing, and the thing that really made us to think about nationalism, was what happened after. This exhibition, before it was opened, before it was announced, caused a big uproar in Montenegro. Caused a big uproar, big criticism, media attack, and the patron of the exhibition, which was self-proclaimed prince or the monarchist of Montenegro, was very much against this artwork, even though before he was supporting and backing up, because this was not the first edition of that biennial, he was backing up Oleg Kulik work with sodomizing dogs, or he was backing up, I forget, an artist to paint icons with fecalias and stuff like that. But when it came to opening the embassy of the Kosovo art, it was seen, Kosovo embassy as an art, it was seen as an unacceptable provocation. The total subversion, the full transgression. And but curators were courageous, they had the courage, they opened it, and they did somehow that the vandals, it was vandalized, and in, I don't know, 1 or 2 days, Albert definitely knows better, can correct, destroy it. And in that limbo, work was not reinstalled, and curators couldn't get a proper position. So there we see actually nationalism has something else too, can be subversive, or the national, or the reclaiming the state, especially when you are part of the state which is unrecognized, like let's say in Palestine, you know, being a nationalist, having the nationalist discourse is also always connected with the internationalist discourse, connected with solidarity, connected with the class issue and total transformation of all the social field, I would say. So that was in 2004 something for me personally, I'm talking here, a challenging situation, that you cannot have a black and white position towards nationalism. The contradictions of nationalism cannot be abstracted in their totality. You cannot abstract nationalism. Always you have to pull down into the concrete political context, references. Otherwise, it just floats in the air. So in this text that I am mentioning to you, I find myself pretty naive. Many years ago, but it is not because I was lacking in information, but it is because the approach I had toward nationalism, the idea then I had using Louis Althusser's apparatus theory that nationalism is one of the ideological apparatuses which interpolates, takes you into the world of ideology, and that football, TV, the banal nationalist cultural references do that, but they do it as they do it very banally. So the contemporary art would do that interpolation in a more sophisticated way. That means would take in also those subjects which were randomly left out because they were not watching football or whatever, or they were not into banal nationalist forms. But I think this is a very naive approach to nationalism. Why? Because it was not dealing with a political concrete reference. So after this detailed self-criticism, I have to tell a little bit of the publication and the conference in 2006 in Station, and it was one of the first actually public programs of Station. With Mina Eriksson, artist from Finland, we organized a conference, international conference called Alternate Identities, where we discuss the, let's say, different strategies to find that Andi that I was mentioning, that counter-argument against nationalism. The reason that there was Mina Eriksson from Helsinki, Finland, we had the people from Nordic parts, and actually was supported by Nordic monies, the conference. But the idea is that René Bloch has done similar exhibitions before Balkans in Nordic countries and created something called Nordic Miracle. Then imagining the Nordic mystique in identifying with the forest, nature, with a very, very problematic references. So we kind of thought that we could kind of package all these things in one, let's say, position. The book came out, we worked on this, and a year later we published a book with another institution. Has a few commissioned texts dealing with a more theoretical aspect of nationalism, like Boris Buden, Sarat Maharaj. Actually, Sarat Maharaj's text is now actual more than ever, because he was, this is 2004, criticizing. We have to now look at this, what exactly, which documenta was criticizing an attempt to re-Germanize documenta, which is now happening. I mean, can you imagine? So this is very interesting text, was not published, but I gave a talk, and Miško Šulaković texts. I mentioned a few people, so you have to just to know that there were people here and there doing stuff. Miško Šulaković wrote an excellent text back then, and that was quite an influence, called Soros Realism. He, because look, it's really funny, but I mean now funny, but in 2000s, most of the contemporary art centers in post-socialist countries were supported by Soros. And they were called Soros Center for Contemporary Art. In Riga, Vilnius, they are still called Soros Center for Contemporary Art. That, I mean, don't ask me why, but Ljubljana, Belgrade, Sarajevo, Zagreb changed their names. But this Soros Center for Contemporary Art, or Soros Art, he had one very he is an art scholar, art historian who wrote a PhD on political period of art and language. So, into that kind of stuff. And he analyzed what kind of forms, what kind of discourse this Soros art is producing. It is very lucid text. And of course there is a nationalism very much there present among one components of this Soros realism. Text by Rasto Mochnik, also here, which is the text studying one artist from Croatia, Sanja Ivekovic, her counter-argument to nationalism. So this is a possibility of using contemporary art for opposing nationalism. Then we have some cultural policies, mostly from the Nordic countries, which were using a shield of contemporary art, or what we call the art washing, to implement some policies for making the integration of the immigrants into the Nordic countries more difficult. So you would have to know some contemporary artists who, or you know, they would ask like, who is, when you go to this applying for the residency permit or the citizenship, they will ask you to recognize Asger Jorn. You know how many of you, like I mean, you know, of course, but like Asger Jorn, you know, was one of the questions. So look, this is the bunch of text dealing with that. Sweden, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, and case studies, which are the most interesting from all around, mostly Balkans, but also Russia, criticizing Timur Novikov, one text, and others and others. Book came out in 2007, and that I was thinking that would be the last thing I do about nationalism. I would never care about it. But in 2008, I just, before jumping, I will show some other work that was done in that period, the formation period of Kosovo, contemporary art, so that you see and remember them. This is Sokol Večeris, all male artists.
Yeah.
Pretty chauvinistic, highly problematic. Fuck You is a work by Sokol Večeri, and it is like Albanian flags, his family making with this marine signs, I think. Work by Sezgin Boynik, 2001 or 2, I think. Shkurte Feza is singing, it's a song of traditional folk artist singing about Europe in Albania. Hey you, it starts, hey you Norway, hey you, like all listing all countries, Western countries, recognize us, we are old patriots. And she was, this is Shkurte Feza, is famous singer here, would abstract it into a white background and use as almost a ready-made cultural object. No critical engagement. She is there. You will listen to her song, which she anyway sings, and anyway hear in the national context. This is maybe another work that I want to show. Yeah, quite emblematic work, also by Sezgin. It's called Transition, from the masculine ritual to pioneer statement to Europe. So identity politics, like, and I forget flag on the moon for the first time. This is also a scholar. Anyway, this was the works back then. I will show now another, and which is because it is a part of an event that I want to talk briefly. Let usurpated these nationalism or national identity discussions within the contemporary art. It is a work by Ren Manichi, who actually has very good works, but stopped making art. This is a piece he did in 2003 called Face to Face. You will see Elvis Presley in style of Andy Warhol, face to face with Adem Yashari, who was a militant, a guerrilla of a KLA, also a Russian army, which is murdered by Serbian police, together with all his family. So, I mean, the idea very simple, okay? It's like a pop culture, the militant, a guerrilla turned into a pop culture entity, whatever strong connotations have. But this is okay. The more important is this. So, this is from 2008. You see the work, the KLA site of the installation, Adem Yashari site is vandalized. And this happened in Belgrade in 2008. In Belgrade, actually first in Novi Sad, was opened an exhibition called Odstupanje in Serbo-Croatian, which means exception, not an exact translation, but I cannot come better, neither they did. It was an exhibition because, you know, the hot potato of contemporary art, the most difficult subject to deal with, and still is, Kosovo's relationship with Serbia. And curators felt, and are still feeling less, because now contemporary art doesn't have that mandate, political mandate, as you can see with Manifesta, if you had a chance to look at it. This time was very important that contemporary artists would have something to say about this difficult topic of Serbia and Kosovo relationship. And in 2008, 4 curators, quite an interesting curators, who were involved in alternative scene as well, I read their names, Kristijan Lukic, Gordana Nikolic, Ivana Marjanovic, and Vida Knežević, organized an exhibition called Exception, Contemporary Art Scene from Pristina. Nowhere you had to read Kosovo, and nowhere Albania. The reason they were all recognizing that Kosovo is an independent of Serbia and should be recognized as an independent country. Privately, politically, let's say. But the reason they didn't use Kosovo, and especially Albanians, because they didn't want to reduce it into identity. So it is, okay, we are from Belgrade, we are contemporary artists, we don't care about nationalism, but we like these people, they are cool, progressive, contemporary, we will do their exhibition. And in the exhibition, it's first opened in Novi Sad, in the northern part of Serbia, which is semi-autonomous Vojvodina in Yugoslavia, as you know. Yugoslavia, those who are not from this part, had the 6 republics. Serbia had the 3 autonomous provinces, North Vojvodina, South Kosovo. Recognized as almost on the republican level, but were not by 74 constitution. 74 constitution of Yugoslavia. So Vojvodina opened, well received. The head of the Museum of Contemporary Art, the president of the Assembly of the Autonomous Province of Vojvodina gave speeches, all went fine. But then it moved to Belgrade in February 7th. This exhibition was attacked first was Shield by the neo-Nazi group called Obraz, and then one who was the member of the art association, official art association, state art association, entered in and destroyed Dren's piece. Because said this is blasphemy, this is like unacceptable, we have a terrorist. For Serbs, Adem Yashari is represented as a terrorist, we cannot have this. And the rocks and fights and everything, the exhibition was stopped, couldn't be opened. And in that emptiness of the exhibition, you have a 1 month slot, a space, and there is no exhibition. What happened was very interesting in Belgrade. By the way, this was like just a few weeks, couple of weeks before the declaration of the Kosovo independence. So it's a politically very tense moment. And then the Serbian scholars, curators, writers, some people who are often guests in Station, reorganized as a radnici u kulturi, workers in culture, and try to think why such exhibition cannot be opened in Belgrade. And that triggered a lot of discussion, a lot of publications, discussions, non-stop some communication, which elevated these our 2004 traumas, or let's say removed them into a more concrete political references. So that was the moment that I decided to look at a more critically of this relationship, and what then actually followed as my own, let's say, thesis is that I missed that, I would not say duality, but a complexity of nationalism. In 2004-06, it was barely visible for me and for many of people involved in contemporary art, but it was coming, it was there. It became more visible, now it's maybe a bit provocative thesis, with an intervention of Vete Vendosje. Vete Vendosje was formed in the beginning of 2000s as a movement. It's a cold self-determination, mixture of fanonist, leftist ideas, very popular among the youth, very popular among the let's say, activist youth. And in 2010, they reformed as a party and continue to, and still continue. Now they are a ruling party. The prime minister is from that party and all. But that moment, this is, let's say, a thesis which I'm opening to discussion. That is the moment where we realize that the nationalism, it all became obvious even for us who are not involved in this subject. Nation and nationalism is not one solid, unified, or one thing that we can think in an absolute abstract terms like Kosovo or Albanian nationalism. We saw how within the nation emerging something new. Same, speaking Albanian, occupying the same national state institutions. This reminds me to one book about Amir Baraka, if you know, African-American poet, which is called Nation Within a Nation. And the thesis, that is the thesis of Frantz Fanon, that there is a two nationalism always conflicting with each other. Cultural and revolutionary nationalism. Cultural nationalism always reproducing, reaffirming the old, reaffirming the status quo, the culture, and the revolutionary nationalism or organizational nationalism, the nationalism or nation that can be used as forming some new political language and things like that. So in 2010, 10, I guess, or 14, 15, veterans started a series of interventions within the parliament, the highest national institution you can imagine, throwing the tear gas bombs while the parliamentary discussions are happening. So this was a group, like Albanian political group within the Kosovo highest national institution is opposing that before the tear gas would be identified with the, let's say, Serbian police intervening the Albanian students and all that. So that created a little short circuit, I would say, and for me it was an important moment to maybe scratch a bit further and try to find how now we can rethink all this artwork, the role of contemporary art, the role of, let's say, art institutions in dealing with nationalism, while also considering that complex layers of how nation and state are related and maybe sometimes even opposing to each other. So yeah, that's my, let's say, contemporary, like now actual position that I am now trying to research. I'm finishing now, just to mention this, to research by using a term of Leon Trotsky called uneven and combined development, that he applied in studying revolutionary, let's say, moment in Russia after 1917, which is to say that every contemporary formation is an amalgamation with a very archaic forms. This is problematic, but can give a chance to a revolutionary or a strong, let's say, these anti-energies, the anti-potential. So this is the current of my interest, where I will engage with contemporary art and writing, and I'm trying to put nationalism and also putting from these parts in contemporary art to that perspective. So thanks, and I'm waiting for your intervention, questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Sezgin. I will try to respond later. First, let's give the floor to Sezgin and then Andi.
I actually really enjoyed the presentation. It was very interesting. I really enjoyed reading both of the work that you said prior to coming here. I really much appreciated all the contribution, which is highly empirical, that something Kosovo lacks when it comes to intellectual work. However, there are some things that, for me, as a national studies scholar, are quite intriguing. You claim that nationalism hasn't been very much relevant in your initial understanding in the 2003, 2004, 2005 work, which for me is striking in general, because everything that I do is related to nationalism. And to some of you who might have visited the National Museum of Kosovo recently, or the Museum of Kosovo recently, there is something that fascinates me. Contradiction is actually the essence of our identity today as Kosovars. Because our constitution is multi-ethnic. It's designed in that way that we should actually accommodate all ethnicities that live in Kosovo, all communities. However, the National Museum of Kosovo, with all its symbolism, is ethnocentric. The whole idea of the identity within the National Museum, which, again, I find it striking, is that it narrates the story of the Kosovar from a clearly ethnocentric perspective, while completely, in so many ways, avoiding the fact that Kosovo actually negotiates its present-day memory every day by trying to portray the nation from a multi-ethnic and civic perspective. So many of us neglect that part. And I find it fascinating how we talk about art and everything else, whereas in the main institution that actually is supposed to archive, to preserve, and actually show the evolution of art within the country in general, artifacts, the representation, the narrative, actually poses in literal contradiction with this state after the 2008 represents.
Do you say that we are not enough nationalists?
Opposing that, actually. I do believe that it's really, really fascinating. Second part of what I find striking is the argument with the idea of symbolism. To cite Durkheim, symbolism actually makes social life possible. It's only the idea of vast symbolism that actually makes identities. And what reminded me is the 2 times that I visited really 2 interesting places which are actually contested. First of all is Palestine. When I passed the West Bank to see the Waldorf Museum, which for me it was actually reminiscing so many of what we've experienced as Kosovo, and how our identity in so many ways fights to strive in opposing to something that is repressive. And Palestine was full of art. The walls over there were all with political messages. Contemporary art there, Banksy and everything else, were actually sending political messages. It was a negotiation with present-day memory. Art was a response to political issues. And this brings me to the question, do you see contemporary art as a response to present-day memory, to political situation, to negotiation with whatever in politics?
Well, first to maybe personally why I was not interested in nationalism, I can tell. I was interested in punk and Socialist International. For me, these things were completely opposite side of nationalism. With nationalism, of course, I was interested. It was there, reading about nationalism and trying to understand what's going on. But I found the works dealing with the nationalism formally and visually pretty poor. So that's why I was not interested in nationalism in contemporary. Not I was not interested in nationalism. I was very, very much interested in nationalism, especially because of my, let's say, identity. I am a Turkish-speaking, from the Turkish-speaking minority community in Israel, and I kind of know one thing. This nationalism, that's what I researched, this nationalism has nothing to do with contemporary, but this nationalism would not exist, this nation, Turks in Yugoslavia, would not exist if there was no socialism after Second World War. Because it was backed by, let's say, a socialist aspiration following the Leninist dictum that every nation has a right of self-determination culturally, and which means you have to have a right to express yourself within your mother tongue. So nationalism for me, of course, it was there from the day I started, let's say, talk. But and on top of it, I was lucky enough because my family were very much aware that this nationalism is part of the, let's say, a socialist idea. Of course, they stopped that in the 90s when I was 15, 16, but to me, it was stayed with me and still is there. So nationalism was the topic, not nationalism in contemporary art. That entered by accident, you know, because the year that was the only thing, more or less. Another thing about nationalist theories, I think I skipped that part, but national theories of nationalism are pretty complex. Some, because like, what is nationalism? What to represent? Nationalism or nation is a pretty heterogeneous. You might dislike his position or not, but Etienne Balibar, for example, with Immanuel Wallerstein, has this text on nation, state, and race. And what their position is that nation is reproducing itself continuously. If there was not a reproduction, there would not, you know, and while it's reproduced, it also assimilates and includes everything. One Slovenian theoretician, quite important to me, I don't know how many of you have read his text, it's called Rastromochnik. You will read soon, because Verso is publishing a collection of his texts. I have to mention who he is. He's still alive, but writes from beginning of 70s. In fact, the initiator of this Lacanian school, you know, which Zizek is mostly associated with, but his idea was to connect with the Marxist, leftist understanding of national canons. He left Lacan pretty early, but did the other stuff which are very interesting. So, Mochnik's thesis is, nation is a zero institution. A zero institution that doesn't have a material existence, but it is somehow disseminated in all existing institutions. He built a very complicated theory using a mixture of, because I said got rid of Lacan, but put inside someone else called Greimas, semiotics. So it's very complicated, but overall the idea I like is that nation as a zero institution. Where is the nation? Where does the nation sit? Where is the home of nation? So it's, I mean, that question that I ask, I like this question, not maybe his analysis, but his question, and that this question makes us to think other sides of nationalism, patchiness, heterogeneity, heterogeneous structure, and all that stuff.
What, again, is really interesting. Sidama Valovan published a recent book on the 21st century nationalism and race in Britain, and he argues exactly this ability of nationalism to traverse within the ideological spectrum. What makes nationalism really, really interesting is the fact that you can position it either in the right, on the left, or in the center, or almost in every part of the ideological spectrum. And which makes it really more interesting is actually the idea that not only nationalism is actually can be positioned in each part of the ideological spectrum, but it's also one of the most powerful rhetorical devices, and it's one that has been used for so long as a means of persuasion. And I believe that rhetorical device is useful also in contemporary art, because it's this device that's used through nationalism to convince people of their identity politics, of their worth. Shkodori's work, Heta's work, all these elements of identity politics and these interesting reflections of who we are or who we can be. Actually, the 2004 artwork that Heta presented in Cetinje has so much symbolic values, because it's also a prediction of the future, it's an imagination of the future, but it's also an imagination of who we want to be, who we are going to represent, who we are. And that strikes me as very interesting and very fascinating.
Question?
Thank you. It's a comment and a question also. I would mention maybe these three aspects or layers that what collective feels identifies as, what the institutions, local and like state and also independent institution favoritize or prioritize, and what the international scene chooses or shows. I'm referring to Venice Biennale and also film festivals. And I think the last decade, it was mainly the same narrative represented, which comes down to Albanian victim of the war. And I'm not going into what the work, is it good or not. Most of the works I liked, but I'm seeing it that it can be problematic if we do not explore different layers, as you said. There are a lot of layers that should be represented, and Kosovo history, it's not just Albanians, and like literally what we built in now, it was shared with other ethnicities. So, why is this happening? Like, why the ministry is favoring certain artworks or artists to represent, or are they even aware that they are actually, are they doing this in purpose? Because maybe that would be smart, but maybe not. Or is it just that the international scene wants to put Kosovo in a box that they kind of find it like romanticized, or I don't know, this idea of artists in Kosovo, victims, and coming now and doing this. I'm talking like pretty...
But wait,
yeah.
let's talk. Let's think about who represented. Let's think about who represented Kosovo in Venice.
Yeah,
do you see
the only difference?
But Laka's work, was it very...
All of them were the war-related, I think. How I understood.
Actually, here everything is related to war.
No, it's not anything related.
But, okay, as I remember, was not so directly. But look, there is another work. The Albert can speak more about it. We are forgetting about histories. There is when Sister Jaffa represented Albania. Albert did also an artwork through Influx that they announced that Sister Jaffa actually is representing a Kosovo parliament. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Any of you? Okay. So there is, let's say, there is that margin of tolerance within the contemporary art to intervene and to do this kind of, let's say, short circuits. But there are times when this doesn't work out. Of that national representation, of that peaceful coexistence.
Also in films.
I will tell about another example, not in Venice. It was a big exhibition planned in Stockholm called When It's East, West Meets East. Exhibition created by Victor Misiano and another, I'm sure you know, Aman. He is not anymore in circulation, but a curator from Sweden. They made a big exhibition involved with most of the Slovenian theoreticians also, had a discursive program, had a Western artist and Eastern, mostly from Russia. And what happened during the opening, that Oleg Kulik, who was performing a dog, really bite the journalist. And bite and took the piece out from journalist's note. Because he was acting an angry dog. Another artist called Alexander Brenner destroyed. He was performing drums in the opening. Contemporary artist. While he was playing the drums, he stood and destroyed, completely vandalized a work of Vendagu, very complex, a work of a tunnel of the hairs which was done using hairs of different people in the world. Destroyed the work of an artist that he's sharing the exhibition. What happened? A lynch, more or less, of these two Eastern artists. And the reason, then after, the only people who stood to defend these two vandal Russian artists were Yugoslavian theoreticians. And why? We have to think about it. Renata Salecel, Igor Zabel, Rastko Mochnik, all these people wrote to texts, articles to defend. The rest of contemporary art demonized what these people have done. But when they ask, why you have done this? The answer is very simple. They got 4 times less fees than the Western artists. They got worse hotels. Production was less. I mean, this is the reason, these are the concrete reasons which goes beyond the symbolic representation of your national, let's say, belonging, or it goes beyond the identity politics. So that is the important moment in, let's say, contemporary art
history, which, of course, when they dig a bit more, came even journalistically very important information that Swedish curators spent more money to cocaine than to what, like the whole the Western Eastern artists and fees, you know.
We feel represented.
So but these are the concrete stuff that, for example, the artists felt that they are excluded, they are not part. Of course, the identity things was there. They already the way how the exhibition was formulated and stuff. So yeah, I just wanted to mention. So
I wanted to say something which I really find important. There is a tendency of exoticizing the work coming from the Balkans in general, also from countries that are in transitional post-conflict situations in particular. So there is this tendency, if you see also the biennales or the institution actually accept your work, you're going to be able to judge by your ability to serve something that's interesting for the international or the Western audiences. I find this highly problematic as well, but that's the case in most situations. You might be able to notice this also in the literary contribution of the IUP, which again has produced a very interesting work, a fascinating book. However, the global impact that it has generated is also interrelated with the fact that the book has been so interesting for the Western audiences to learn about Albania from the perspective of what they never knew it actually happened. So that ability to exoticize the fact that there was a socialist, Leninist attempt to govern a state in Albania is also very intriguing to the Western audiences that couldn't be able to imagine that happening in one of these major Western countries.
I want to connect a little bit to the exhibition that was happening in 2003 by Sezgin Boynik, and then I think there were others in Peter Osborne.
Peter Weidel.
Yes, and so how do you think that has changed later on? And I do think that there's a sort of different engagement with nationalism and contemporary art in Kosovo in early 2000 and post sort of independence. And what about the approach or the curatorial methodology of the curators of the exhibition that happened in Budapest in the museum? That was the whale, that was the submarine, which I think has a very, very similar sort of approach to how Kosovar and Albanian artists, and I think this is also a very interesting and very problematic sort of aspect of this whole topic for me. That a lot of times Kosovar and Albanian artists are written under the same sort of, and put together under the same grouping and the same framework. And those exhibitions in 2000, the work, like early 2000 especially, were coming from two very different socialist contexts between Albania and Kosovo. But there's this like high tendency of always grouping the two of them together. And something that keeps happening, continues to happen also today. And I think that exhibition in 2016 was the latest. The latest sort of approach that was very similar to what sort of mistakes that Lockton's assessment did.
Thanks.
So maybe you can talk about that.
Thanks, Anna. Very good that you mentioned this exhibition. This is an exhibition done in Ludwig Museum in Budapest, 2016. I just read the title so you have a little clue of what's there. It's called The Whale That Was a Submarine, Contemporary Positions from Albania and Kosovo. I wrote for the publication. For me, was completely a new monster. Like
I think this work was also shown.
Yes, to package and present Kosovo and Albanian artists in one sort of frame. This is an ethnically clean exhibition. I find it extremely problematic, you know. For one, the historical references for the Kosovo contemporary, for the Kosovo, yeah, there was a Roma artist also, no?
Yeah.
Look, I also think that historically Kosovo and the Albanian contemporary artists didn't have the same historical background of like from the beginning of 2000, how it was developed and evolved. So I find it this bit of weird packaging, weird curatorial approach, and also you can see it didn't have much continuity, didn't generate a discussion. Unlike the other exhibitions that you mentioned, they have generated a lot of other stuff around books, publications, interventions. Peter Weigel, that you mentioned, that's the result of that exhibition is a book called Balkan as Metaphor, edited by, I forget who was involved, but it is a pretty serious book published by MIT Press. Of course, the Balkan is still a bridge, a metaphor in between. So this 2016 exhibition, I think that was the last kind of attempt, as I remember, and it seems that this exhibition didn't have a question, didn't have a concrete question. It was somehow an attempt to imagine some sort of connection between Kosovo and Albania that didn't work. That's all I
Can
thought.
I say?
Yeah. One.
Yeah. Let's go from the last point, maybe. You're not mentioning that the Looting Museum at that time was under the Urban regime. Right, so they dismissed the former director, then a new director had different ideas. Funnily enough, you participated in that publication as well, so you were part in that as well. I don't know if there was a critique or anything in the publication itself, but they came to us with the project, and I said it's problematic. I said this doesn't work. And I said because they had a list of artists that they owned in their collection, and I said I doubt that at least few of them that we work with, they will accept this invitation. And the director said, but we own their works and we will exhibit them anyhow. So this was the approach of the project, where you were part of. And funny, and it is not funny, but it's serious, because for me, it's maybe coincidence why Manifest had the same color as the color of your book, right? Because you also, yes, because you also participate. Yes, because you are also part in Manifesto as well. So, and the critique there is also missing, I think. But there are a lot of contradictions also. And it's interesting to hear the story once again, because this story about nationalism in contemporary art in Kosovo was present since some time now. And to retell the story, it's interesting to see, because some details are missed, there are some contradictions which are still there, but for me it's interesting to try to deconstruct it together, if we can. Right, and I don't want to take a lot of time, but this is not an interesting opportunity, but also a case maybe to analyze it. The initial contradictions are in 2004, when you attempt to formulate the story, you had one big flaw in the story that you could not read properly Albanian. This was one issue. And the information that you had were stories, mostly. For instance, you said in your presentation that, and I'm mostly talking directly in connection with my work. Because I was there, and we made this discussion already in 2006 and 2007, so this is interesting to hear it now. For instance, you said, and for an academic, to say that work was critiqued in Java, it's an important fact. And in your text, it's also a footnote.
Yeah.
But in the footnote itself, it doesn't cite exactly which edition of Java. It says it was told by the editor of Java. So it's based on a gossip, basically. It's not, and to have a footnote based on a gossip and to be in academic world, it's a problem. And that's the first problem. And then I was very happy that you decided to study the Black Wave, because I thought this is good for you, because I thought that the attempts to analyze and to critique nationalism in contemporary art in Kosovo were a failure. Were a failure because you could not distinguish a mere fact that Kosovo state and a Kosovo nation is a subversion to the Albanian nation and to the Serbian nation. So if you talk about Kosovo identity, and if you name a project Missing Identity, which was the project name supported by Relations Project, was a subversion. You were challenging the dominant narratives of what the Albanian nation is and what the Kosovo nation can be. Because at that time, there was no idea of a Kosovo nation, because there was no Kosovo state. So to label someone as a nationalist when he talks about the Kosovo nation or a Kosovo state is a flaw, right? It's a basic problem that you fail to recognize. And these discussions were ongoing, even at that time. But also how a theoretician and a critical theoretician operates within this setting, for me, was interesting to observe. And I was back then only an artist, right? So I had the position of an artist, and the institution itself was also created in discussion, because it was meant to be an institution which represents horizontal positions. And even this presentation organized tonight, I had no idea if it would be about this or others, and it was similar with the initial conference, because everyone in the institution had the right to initiate their own projects. Right? And then we would just appear as guests, and we would discuss. But your relation towards power was always problematical since the beginning, and this is for me a problem. You said there was a conference in 2007. There was a conference. The conference was censored by a book, because the book was published for power. Power was that other project, the German Cultural Foundation project. And it's censored. No, it's not an attack. It's just to give some facts. No.
I'm not considering it as an attack.
No, it's not an attack. It's not an attack. Because both publications on the table there are both edited by the same group of people, right? Same institution, contemporary art in Kosovo and nationalism and contemporary art. It's the same institution, the same supported Missing Identity project. So both publications are Missing Identity project. Yes, exit
supported by Missing Identity.
Yes, Missing Identity. And even the other publication, they approached us to be part of the, because they were generous enough to include as much as they could. But I said, I think it's a problem, and it's better that you do it on your own, and it's fine. But I think the position that you have to acquire when you claim that there's a critique has to have some ethics in it as well. How do you position yourself, for instance? And we discussed even about this. Yes.
Very legitimate.
Yes. Also, you said there was no woman artist in these Balkan exhibitions, or that dealt with these issues. That's also not true. You had the work by Medita Kocic, which was part of the exhibition by Annie Block. She was present. You had works by her in billboards in Pristina with the Albanian flag as well. So there's a lot of gaps in the observation. I'm not going to call it research. A lot of gaps which, when they are filmed, change the story. This is the issue. And the story is very interesting because also Manifesta invests a lot in storytelling. And I think it's very powerful. And you can fall easily if you don't let's say, include these gaps and try to fill these gaps with information. And there are more. And this is only the beginning. For instance,
Shall we deal with those you have like 50 accusations?
It's not accusation. No, okay, listen. It's not accusation. I'm trying to respond to fill the gaps which I think exist, right? And because every artist in that initial presentation, they try to deal with this level of, you can call them also accusations, in 2007. And each in their own way tried to deal with that situation, right? But in the end, what was not fair was that the documentation of the conference was lost. So the documentation of the conference, which dealt with presentations of artists, and instead of those attempts of artists to not to defend their work, but to give their view on issues that they were dealing with, there was a publication which did not include their views at all.
I think people even don't understand what you are trying to say. But I can make it clear.
No, but people
It is a conference. Let me just.
You cannot talk on behalf of the people, first of all. So people have their own voices, and they can say if they don't understand. But I'm just trying to open up the discussion on this and to understand the position that you represent.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm representing so many things. Didn't know about the importance of this, but one thing. This is not an academic article. I think you missed the main point. I haven't written an academic article. Never claimed writing an academic article. For me, it's nationalist, so I don't have an exact bibliographical reference on Java. And I don't say direct what editor was saying, but saying this. Wait, I will find it. Come on, just national. Its footnotes are so small, but I can, for instance, the editor of the weekly journal, I'm not writing, said to me, weekly journal, just Java defined this view. You know what? For me, this
And also, to give the context, Java magazine was promoting heavily the idea of cluster identity, future, and it was very important.
That's fine. That was more or less the only thing we had.
Yes.
But the most important for me was not an academic test. There is a more inaccuracy.
It's a story.
From Merita Kotsi, this was a way to find Andi. Because the thing which was presented to us was so brutal, was so strong. You had the best creators, the best institutions, and we had to fit within that narrative and story. So it was very impatiently written. 20 years ago.
Why impatient?
No, I mean, you know how was it? It was an exhibition, so you had to find a way to write something, and I was thinking, this is over, it's finished. This subject for me is, occasionally I write about nationalism and contemporary. That's not the thing I'm dealing with. Doesn't even interest. Contemporary art, the unevenness, the archaic forms in contemporary art, what interests me. More than nationalism, what interests me today in contemporary art is the art market, the presence of very brutal capitalism, which is maintained by oligarchs, maintained by few people, very organically connected to curators, institutions, run by the state monies for the private institutions. That is, for me, the problem today.
Why? This is the problem. I'm interested.
Why is the problem? Because these oligarchies presence in contemporary art now generates a new relations between the art. Very nepotistic, very corrupt, very traditionalist, which very familiar ties, old connections. Somehow now I bit exaggerate, of course. It's as if we have an ancien regime in front of us. This structure, even what makes it even more scandalous, is supporting the contemporary art. So the most what is supposed to be advanced stuff. Coming back to your criticisms, I cannot go to all of them now because jump to manifest to alter identity. I don't know. How can I say about manifesto? Of course, I would like to sit down and criticize. There's a lot of things to talk about. I didn't take part personally. We have a collective. For us, manifesto was an opportunity to make a one project. Let's say, if you want me to answer here, I'm not building a projection that manifesto will introduce a new or more egalitarian, democratic, open forms within contemporary. I don't have that illusion. you know very well. I mean, okay, good. This is the little compromises, so you don't need to make a big compromise. If you want me to be more honest, I cannot do than this, you know. Big compromise means that you really have to then connect with, I don't know, oligarchs or what, but I would not like to continue with personal discussion now in this moment. So if you have some questions about nationalism or some formulation, I can continue. Otherwise, I am done with this, you know.
No, but it's not, when you present it, you don't say it, I'm done with this, because you,
Of course I can.
you brought it for discussion, right?
Yeah,
So,
but
and
I
it's-
think if you have a
there's
question
nothing-
about not a personal,
No,
but
but
some
there's nothing personal in what we are discussing. I'm not talking
Yeah.
about anything that's personal.
The question about the conference, I didn't understand. Conference,
people didn't understand. That's what I was
Yeah, but this is what needs to be explained. I mean,
Because I don't want to be in between this conversation, I'm just gonna
It's good to
I'm just gonna make up my. Might be good.
No, stay there.
So first of all, I'm just gonna try and explain or try and give my perspective on both arguments. I understand Hita's critique, and I believe that minor inaccuracies or major inaccuracies have to be addressed. However, there is the postmodernist turn in social science has made a major impact on the way we understand stories and narratives. There is something that Foucault calls the effective history, that talks about how history cannot be interpreted linearly, and talks about the opportunity to interpret parts of history exactly within the ruptures. So what Sezgin has tried, at least, is to explain a part of history that actually happens in rupture. That's historical rupture. It might have been an opportunity to address certain parts of contemporary art and its relationship with nationalism. Of course, the postmodernist turn has created so many things to be criticized when it comes to art, to social sciences, because there has been a tendency to relativize most of the arguments are being made. However, I believe that it's really important to appreciate all kinds of works and to understand that minor inaccuracies don't necessarily mean that certain works should not be treated or should not be the part that is correct should not be like the really important part that we can discuss. The inaccuracies should be addressed, and there is an opportunity for both of us to write an article to address the inaccuracies that have been addressed.
It's just too easy. But yes, please.
Go for it. You take this one.
we will talk about the conference and the edition later. About the conference and the edition, you will explain us later, drinking something.
Yeah.
The question I have now is more question of, I understand very well what you say. If you are writing articles, it's a critical art critical approach. We have all to live in this complex situation, I understand very well. The question is for me maybe a little more, where is the place, what is the place, which is the place of criticism? That means, how can we, the problem with the subject of nationalism, as in the example you talk about this, the fact that it is nowhere and everywhere, in this zero structure, it poses a problem that you can never really address critical discourse because you are not in front of a structure that you can somehow distinguish from other structures, dismantle, and reorganize in critical discourse. So it seems to me also that in some of the questions that Andi is posing, there is the question of how can you construct criticism in analyzing artworks that are addressing in some context, or Andi is coming back of a context, a precise context, and saying, in this moment, the critique is in this place and not in this other place, it deals with that and not with that other thing. It is a kind of approach of structural criticism. You talked about criticism, but you did not say so clearly how can we dismantle this non-clear national atmosphere. Because the question of where is the critic seems to me important in this context.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I think, I don't know, maybe we can talk about the way to do it. Maybe to look at some works that you find interesting. But a clear answer to that, or maybe a more conceptual answer to that, I don't know, would be perhaps some more international works. I mean, I can tell the stuff that interests me, maybe that will help you, the examples where language are destroyed, or, the national sort of carriers, the carriers of the national language or traditions are really destroyed. And now today, I think this happened in internationalist politics. I would not say leftist, like in the old Marxist tradition of the leftists, but there are a lot of activists, anarchists also in the world, which are like, I would say, organically internationalists. Like, so my answer to it is very simple. It's internationalism. It's like really to connect each of the local struggle to an international world. Capitalism is per se international, ad hoc international by itself, but it is the oppressive international. So that will anyway give us the pretext to internationalize our whatever local story, like Brecht, for example. If you read the Penny novel, what you have there, how it starts, the first page, you have a picture of that beggar. Why he is a beggar? Because he was fighting in the South Africa laws because of the patriotic, whatever, national war. And if you make that connection, that internationalism, and I believe now you can make, we have to be able to make it. Not to reduce to, like in our case, Serbia and Kosovo, or only Kosovo, or Albania, or whatever. So that internationalism means you are connected to struggles happening elsewhere, like Palestinian, you gave an example, in Palestine. The nationalism, the nationalism will break, because you are with that kind of opposing the apparatus, or the Chiapas, or like Mexican social movements, activists, when they greet Kurdish guerrillas, they greet, I don't know, the Angola fighters, or this, it's there, it's connected, because it's the same oppressive structure. So that, I think, is one answer, I don't know. And to make it a bit complicated, or make it more deeper than what would be the forms. So 20th century as a rich examples, and now also emerging the new stuff of using an abstraction as a way to escape that national thing. Beginning of 20th century, you know very well, teach that from Malevich to Mondrian to all these people, the abstraction, that universal, whatever language it is, and it's coming from Vitebsk, in the Belarus, a small city, and it's emerging with a new language. So 70s, 80s, maybe more difficult forms are giving us more chance to engage with internationalism. That would be my very immediate answer, like how art can enter into it, but not to reduce it art to immediate identifications, quick jokes, the things that are emptied out immediately, very recognizable visual forms, things that you can automatically identify with. This maybe not, but what else? So that would be, now don't ask me what, I mentioned already 2 persons, okay, but because they are kind of beginning, let's say Kazimir Malevich, but we can expand and try to find That is at least my approach. Can be wrong, but that's how I think about what can art do, how can art contribute to this.
Can I give my perspective? So the problem with criticizing nationalism per se is understanding what kind of nationalism are actually we're trying to criticize.
I was not saying criticize nationalism. What is the method of criticism to analyze nationalism?
Yeah, that's why I meant criticizing, not in pejorative term, criticizing and understanding nationalism. Understanding nationalism is mostly related to its contextual form that it takes. Either being primordial, or being ethno-symbolist, or being constructivist approach to nationalism. It's really important to understand the particularity of the place we're trying to deal with. And only in that moment we can try and understand the way that nationalism actually operates in between these kind of ideological spectrums. It's impossible to deconstruct nationalism as an ideology alone. It's because the problem with nationalism is not ideology itself. It's applicable within different spectrums of ideology. So it's only our opportunity to deconstruct it. This only happens when we understand the ideology that we're dealing with, and we understand that nationalism is actually a device, a rhetorical device, a way that we negotiate the identity and everything else. If we go back to understanding the importance of art and everything else and its relation to nationalism, I would think it's useful to the dialectic of enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno played a really important role in deconstructing the role of modernity per se, and the Enlightenment also in deconstructing the role of the epistemological structure that capitalism operates on. It's only, according to them, it's only possible to deconstruct the epistemological structure of capitalism to be able then to deconstruct the whole idea of modernity and everything that has produced afterwards. Which also brings into attention that nationalism is, according to most theorists, or relevant theorists, a product of modernity, and it's also very much interrelated with that period of time.
Critical voices also that criticize the Kurds for being nationalist, the Kurds under the Turkish regime. And it's quite problematic for me. So everything has to be contextualized well and understood well. Because at some point in time, nationalism was also a very powerful tool to fight against oppression. And that's why, in the case of Kosovo, it's important to understand how some of these works are connected with the resistance movement, right? So when Sokol Beçiri says, "Fuck you with Albanian flags," to whom is he speaking, and why these particular flags? And why not? Because this was the only flag at that time used in Kosovo. But you cannot mix the Albanian flag with the Kosovo flag. It was never a Kosovo flag. So the Kosovo flag is something else. It's not the Albanian flag. And Andi tried to show how it's related to these inaccuracies and these contradictions that play a huge role in misunderstandings, right? And in many ways, fake stories as well. And that's why you have to be very precise. You know, Albanian flag is an Albanian flag. It's based on an ethnic, let's say, idea, an ideology. Kosovan flag is not an ethnic flag. It's based on something else. It's based on a different vision of what a state is today. And if there are artists who deal with this new identity and the construction of new identity, it's very difficult to place them within the same bucket with some other works which are depoliticized in its existence. You know, so depoliticized in its existence. But also, the behaviors are very important. Do you act politically and critically? Or how do you align yourself within the existing situations? For me, that was always important. Whom do you represent? Whom you give voice to? And which voices you silence? That's also very important. For any critique to have credibility and to create a model or a role that someone else would maybe in the future aim to acquire.
There's a maybe it's not just
please.
So I'll make it super brief. I've been looking for a mechanism because Andy and I have had conversations about that. Centrism probably pushed him into his current role at some point. And then, kind of above that is this anthropocentrism, just seeing the world through human experience, or humanism, which has been erased in a way. It's now social sciences into these different silos of sciences within the academia. So there must be another method of analyzing this, because it becomes heated, personal, human-centric, and that it always repeats the same cycle. Okay? So there's this, I don't know, it's a big concept, so I know it's late, so maybe I'll just say it, but there's another concept that came out, maybe it's 6 years ago, object-oriented ontology. And there's this Graham Harman. Are you familiar with Graham? His work? He wrote something for not Manifesta but Documenta, the last version around. So it's an attempt to use philosophical concepts that take the center of the idea of an object, and the object could be anything. The object could be the state of Kosovo. The object could be Albanians' centric Kosovo. The object could be a minority within Kosovo. The object could be a single work of art. There's an infinite number of objects. It's whatever you give form to in your mind or something. And the idea of it is to decentralize it from the human perspective. So it takes into this account that maybe we shouldn't be thinking of our cultural base or our future in terms of how it affects the I, how it affects the anthropocentric view of the world. And then you could look at those objects very differently. So you can even imagine, there's a lot of artworks that are out there now, and I'll actually look at Manifesta to see if any are in there, that have their own value outside of any connection to a person, an ideology, a place. And I think that's a really ripe ground to provide a criticism, to provide to look and say, here's where the critic can enter, because it's never going to be an attack. It's just going to be looking at an object, and then trying to understand that object from other objects' perspectives. And that way it takes the heat out of the soup. Because I'm thinking even here, I've got many criticisms about Manifesta, many of them, and I think to myself, how can I write them without harming my former students, without getting into these very specific fights with people? Who's going to write that criticism if it's there? And I don't know if it can happen internally. I think it'll happen, have to happen, outside of this. And final, because I don't know if there's a question there. It's just more like this. Final comment. You're about to attack the art market. That's your goal, your laser focus. I'm so sorry because you look so tired.
Oh, yeah. I'm not tired. There is very bad lead.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Your presentation was very nice, though. It always gets people talking and thinking. I see something else. I see from London and the States, the market is the medium, right? And so there's something in the soup of that space as an object, let's say, that the market, it obviously becomes the medium. Now, where do you go from there? Where do you go from the Damien Hirst kind of critique of the market, right? And it's just this sort of object, and it's interspersed with something else. And in the Balkans, coming in from the outside, spending enough time here, the object or the medium has to do with ethnicities, nationalism, and because it's the soup of the place. So it becomes the medium always. So very often people from the outside come in and they're very disoriented by art from the Balkans. Because they're disoriented by all of the narratives they would need to know to understand what gives it value. But somebody from here, and I know it personally, because I ask my students, did you go to Manifesta? What were the two pieces you like, And it's very personal. It's like very rooted in the ground in a very specific thing, hearing a very specific song, understanding a very specific space. And then I say, wow, I'm going to be a bastard if I criticize that, you know? But that's another object to look at it from. So I'll stop talking, and maybe you have a comment on any of that.
Let me make a little comment. I mean, to me, it makes sense what you mentioned about that human-centered, because the world is going to bloody extinction. I mean, that's why, because of capitalism, because of this, what's going on.
Maybe.
So, that theory, I don't know, but it makes sense. Of course, we have to criticize that human, let's say, which is destroying the world. But reminded me to something else. Actually, this is not so good theory. I mean, not that object, what you said, ontology. I don't know that, but there was a theory in the 80s going on called extermination theory, put forward by exterminism. Phase put forward by E.P. Thompson in 80s. And it was a very international movement trying to oppose the Cold War ideology of the, let's say, Warsaw and NATO Pact. You know, like a leftist cannot criticize because they have some responsibility to Soviet Union. And then E.P. Thompson's position in the 80s, I think now today, is especially with the going on war, with the whole world is now in the brink of collapse, you know, economically, morally, everything. We are in the stage of exterminism, means that the machinery that runs this capitalism, the military industry, it went to such an extreme, such a crazy situation. There is no any more difference between left and right, between NATO and Russia, pacts, whatever, you know. And now where we are coming today, so this reminded me of your critique of like the human-centered, Western-centered thing. What I would maybe make it more concrete, but say the capitalist center, the very greedy capitalist center, the very extreme capitalist-centered human view is the problem.
I think that has
that I would say. And about art market, because Esther Wesley is also here, I have to mention, we are publishing now a book with translation. That's the things that I am doing, by the way. It is, we're just translated a book by Karl Teige, who was an avant-garde theoretician, wrote on abstraction called The Marketplace of Art, written in 1936. And you read that book of his today, where he criticized the art market. By the way, 30s, it was an economical crisis, fascism, and he is inherently connecting the art market with those that was happening, you know, in US and then in Europe, which would then happen even more extreme. So that kind of histories are interesting. We are publishing as a book, Esther as a commentarist and other scholars, so trying to I mean, you can criticize the art market, you can go to Wikipedia, New York Times is
very easily.
But it's not about these money transactions. Of course, these are problems, but the more problem is that that's become sort of the only option for the most part of the world. I mean, I don't want to extend this.
For success.
Let Andi also to comment. Because
for just one, for success of the artist, you mean? That's the only option, the art market? For an artist to have success, the art market is the thing that they need. That's the only option. That's your argument.
So I'm less critical of capitalism than Dr. Sezgin here. So I'm going to proceed with my other point. I find that the object-based ontology very intriguing. I'm writing a chapter on my PhD about the role of the objects in the interpretation of historical identity, and I particularly focus on the totemism of Book 2, Chapter 7, the elementary forms of religion, pushed from Emil Durkheim. which finds a very, very interesting argument, which I find a very intriguing argument, trying to explain the role of totems in projecting identities. But the problem of trying to argue from a completely objective, object-based ontology is actually removing the individual from that subjective side and understanding that the totem or the artifact or the story is actually relational. For the fact that it's relational is important to the individual in the way that it actually matters. What I found very intriguing about Manifesta, because you mentioned that before, is the post that Dua Lipa recently posted on Instagram.
Yeah.
She explicitly posted a poem that actually is related with the motherland and the meaning of her name. That's her personal subjective experience and its relation to this place and its name and how it actually understands the whole culture and the background it comes from. So I find this approach slightly bit redundant because I do believe it's really important to engage with the subjective side of the individual to understand the approach with the nation and identity in general. What I really find the most intriguing part is understanding the temporal element that the objects have. So to cite Peter Virgil, who is one of the founding fathers of the museology, when he talks about the reticent object, claiming that the objects have no inherent value. However, he argues, drawing from Walter Benjamin's work on the age of mechanical production, when he talks that objects, on the other hand, have aura, talks about some sort of energy of an artifact that has been there for 1,000 years. So that also goes back to Durkheim about the value that the totems have in actually explaining society and who we are and the role of the vast symbolism in our identities in general.
That would be enough for you.
You got an answer.
If anyone else has any other questions or views?
Yeah, I actually have a view. I think that it is very important to write locally because despite the gaps, the article from Sezgin is the only one talking contemporary art and nationalism. It clearly seems that a lot of people have a lot to say about it. So there's a huge lack of writings and a huge lack of criticism locally, which is why you a lot of time ends up having only the other view on what's happening here. So I think it is important to write. I don't think people should take it personally, which is kind of an approach, came across as your approach like that. But it is better if people are writing and feeling these gaps instead of like ending up having like discussions that are more personal. But I
think they're afraid to.
But I think that's what needs to change, that people need to write, and it doesn't matter if people will take, I mean, things don't have to be taken personally because I have a point of view on something.
Right.
But I think it's the biggest problem within the local art scene, that there's no written texts that are covering or get a proper in-depth research or overview of things, like essays here and there, which is why there are
Sezgin about maybe creating a magazine or if that's possible to do that too.
Yeah.
Just to respond initially to your comment, how to do this, what is the method? And I think when you're inside the structure, the possibility for being reflexive, self-critical for your position is a powerful tool. Because sometimes only when you're inside the structure, and there are ongoing discussions, not only about, let's say, the event manifest, but others that give more power. Because there are these positions that think if you're part of something, you cannot be critical. And I think the other way is more, it gives more possibility. If you're self-reflexive, if you think about your role in a given situation, and you can also correct yourself, right? And you can change opinions, and everyone can make mistakes as well. But there's also one reason why there are not enough texts. One, the school has, the University of Pristina has no department of art history, no department of theoretical studies,
Right.
so there are only artists. Two, there's also stories, because when there is no text, no papers, no enough, let's say, critical reviews, you create a lot of space for telling stories, right? And some stories that play a certain role and fill certain gaps. But it's also not bad if there are some things that are personal, but they have to be ethically correct, right? You have to have positions that don't attack the person, but they go after what the person is saying, right?
It's a bit
So
contradictory.
no, it's not contradictory, because like if you confront the arguments with your own positions, that's not very personal. You're confronting the arguments. And I all the time think that we should confront each other's arguments, and this is the discussion that should happen always. Not.
I believe you're right. You're right. I don't use Facebook, Instagram, neither Twitter. I don't know what I believe in that. If you have anything to criticize, you don't need to write an academic text. You just write and whatever, but write, formulate as one text, which is allowing somebody else to reply with that text. That I really like. That is my, let's say, ethics in this.
Yes, but to work.
Yes, but you can also
work
talk.
on this. You need a frame of time.
What?
To work that way, you need a frame of time.
Frame of time. You need a time.
You need time.
You need time for everything.
No, because capitalism and the organization of manifest and the way you, also in the organization of manifest, the way you produce a program, the way you produce performances and something like, don't give time to critical texts. And this is a very important tool of neoliberalism.
You don't need to have their time. You can make your own time.
And this is very nice to say,
Yes.
but very difficult to do. I believe in this, but you have to do it. You see what I mean? I think that I agree with you, but what we have to construct is the frame of time.
That was true that what Albert said earlier, I didn't know Albania. That's true. I write these texts were published in Java, in Arta, in Albania. I was writing them in, here now, Serbian. Skezgin Boynik was translating sometimes Mijan because he was editor. But I think that knowing this language was not a barrier. And, okay, that was, let's say, a limit, gave a limit to some formulations, some theses, some arguments. But then I would like to respond, back then it never happened, that somebody in that Albania would respond, so I would like, that never happened. Never happened.
To end this,
No. I mean, I don't have that dialectical relationship. So what Hannah just said, it's really, no, please, right. Let's engage with texts.
to end this, I'm going to make a Barthian approach. Two dead authors criticizing their work. So two dead authors criticizing their work. It's basically I'm criticizing you and you're criticizing him. So you killed yourself when you published your work. The death of the author. It was a metaphor.
More complicated than the object.
Thank you very much. Thank you.